Ever wish you had like a cheat sheet for everyday American English? Because we're doing this deep dive into a U.S. Department of State resource. It's for people learning English, but
Right.
let me tell you, it's got some real eye openers, even for a native speaker like me.
What I think is so cool is how it goes beyond, just basic words. Like we're talking those little subtleties, the unspoken stuff that can totally change how a conversation goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we all know hello and goodbye, right? But I was honestly surprised by how many ways there are to say hello in American English.
It's really interesting, and the resource does a great job of this, showing how different a formal greeting is, like between a student and a professor, compared to, say, two friends just hanging out. It's
Yeah.
amazing how just your tone of voice and the words you choose can like completely shift the whole mood.
Oh, totally. Like imagine saying, "Good morning, professor," all stiff with a handshake versus just a casual, "Hey, what's up?" Totally different worlds.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting when you start to look at how Americans use phrases like, oh no, because it's not always literal.
Wait, really? What do you mean? Give me an example.
Okay, so picture this. One friend's like, ugh, history exam next week. And the other one goes, oh no, well, good luck. They're not saying the exam doesn't exist, right? It's more like they're acknowledging the stress, like a subtle way of showing empathy.
Wow, yeah. I never thought of it that way. So it's like a code word for I feel you in American English.
Exactly. And these little codes are everywhere, like the classic, what a small world, or long time no see. They sound like just filler, but they actually serve a purpose.
So it's not just small talk, it's like, oh, it's like social glue, right?
Yeah.
Makes the interaction smoother. Which, speaking of, that brings us to another fascinating thing about American English indirect communication.
Ah, yes. The art of not saying exactly what you mean.
Okay, so how does that actually work in real life?
Well, think about it. Instead of just coming out and saying, I want to go to the movies, an American might say, how about a movie tonight? Less direct, more of a suggestion.
Yeah, it's like you're dipping your toe in the water instead of doing a cannonball. Testing the waters, not being too aggressive.
Exactly. And the resource is full of examples like that, using phrases like, would you mind, or would you like to? It's all about making requests politely.
So it's about keeping things harmonious, avoiding conflict, even in casual conversations.
Exactly. And those little cues matter. Even something like ordering food. The waiter might ask, can I start you off with something to drink? Even though, like, of course they're going to offer you a drink.
It's funny how much we understand each other without actually saying it. It's like a secret language. Speaking of secret languages, did you notice how much Americans use the word just? Such a small word, but it does a lot of heavy lifting.
Oh, absolutely. Just is so versatile in American English. This resource highlights two of the most common ways it's used to show something happened recently and to add emphasis.
Oh, give me some examples. How does that actually play out?
Sure. Imagine someone saying, he just left. They're using just to emphasize how recent it was, like it's hot off the presses news.
Right.
But then you have a phrase like, it's just a small town.
Where it just almost minimizes it. Like, don't get me wrong, it's charming in its own way, but don't expect big city thrills.
Exactly. It adds a layer of meaning, a nuance you might miss if you're not hip to the subtle ways Americans use language.
This whole just thing is really making me think. It's like this tiny word is secretly shaping my sentences without me even realizing it.
And that's the beauty of language, isn't it? These small, often overlooked elements can have a huge impact on how we communicate. But this resource we're looking at, it only focuses on American English, which makes me wonder, what happens when you step outside the U.S.?
Is English like totally different in other parts of the world? Like, do those subtle cues we've been talking about, do they even matter in other cultures?
That's a great question, and it really shows how much geography and culture can impact a language. I mean, even within the U.S., you have all these regional differences. Like someone from the South might say y'all instead of you all, and you know instantly where they're from.
Oh, for sure. It's like a linguistic fingerprint, right? But those regional things probably get even crazier when you go to like England or Australia.
Oh, absolutely. England's a perfect example. I mean, the accent alone can be a dead giveaway.
Yeah.
But then you've got words like chuffed, which means pleased, or they say jumper instead of sweater. It's like learning a whole new dictionary.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I remember I was in England once and someone said, Bob's your uncle at the end of a sentence. And I was like, wait, who's Bob? And why is he my uncle? Turns out it just means, there you go,
Yes.
problem solved.
Exactly. And it's not just the actual words, it's the whole cultural context, like direct eye contact. In some cultures, that's super respectful, but in others, it can be seen as rude. Imagine accidentally sending the wrong message with just a glance.
Whoa, that's a good point. We don't even realize how much we're saying without words. This U.S. Department of State thing, it really makes you think about all that. It's like, it's a cultural guidebook disguised as a language lesson.
Mm,
Okay, but before we go totally global on English, let's get back to those American English things. We talked about greetings, cultural cues, indirect communication, but there was one more thing I thought was so insightful.
what's that?
The whole just thing. It's such a small word, just, but it's everywhere in American English.
You're right, just is surprisingly flexible. The resource does a good job explaining two ways we use it a lot. Remember the example? He just left.
Yeah, so they're using just to show something happened recently, like it's hot off the presses,
Right. But then you have phrases like, it's just a small town.
where just almost makes it seem less important. Like, don't get me wrong, it's got its charm, but don't expect any big city excitement.
Got it. It adds this extra layer of meaning, a nuance that you might not pick up on if you're not familiar with how Americans use language.
This just thing is so wild. It really highlights how much we use these tiny words without even thinking about it to tweak our message. But back to this resource for a sec. It's got all this practical advice for real life situations. Like, what do you say if you need to ask someone to move over a seat at the movies? Because it feels so awkward to be like, move.
That is the perfect example of how this resource blends language with cultural etiquette. Because you're right, just coming out and asking someone move,
Yeah.
that could easily come across as rude.
Totally. So how do you handle that minefield politely?
The resource suggests a phrase that walks that line perfectly. Would you mind?
So instead of just being like, move,
Yeah,
you say, would you mind moving over one so my friend and I can sit together?
exactly. It's polite, it's indirect, and it really increases your chances of getting a good response.
It's like magic for those awkward situations. Honestly, this whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. I feel like I'm looking at my own language with fresh eyes. It's amazing what we just take for granted, you know?
It's true. We really do. We use all these phrases and expressions without even thinking about why we say them. And that's what makes this Department of State resource so cool. It's not just memorizing words. It's like unlocking the whole cultural context. That's what gives those words meaning.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for American culture.
Exactly. The more you get those subtle cues, those unspoken rules of how we talk to each other, the better you can connect with people, build those relationships, and just navigate everyday life.
This has been so fascinating, a real deep dive into the hidden stuff in American English. It makes you appreciate the power of language and how much we can learn if we just pay attention.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Language isn't just about words on a page or even the sounds we make. It's a reflection of who we are, how we think, how we interact with the world.
So for everyone listening, here's a little something to think about. Think about your own language, your own culture. What are some of those subtle cues, those unspoken rules that someone else might not get? You might be surprised by what you find. Until next time.